Nick, thanks very much for joining us. Just give us your insights, I suppose, on what to expect for the market for 2021.
It's going to be quite a lot of change. I think that we're moving into the next phase where, rather than just sort of sitting and waiting, we're now looking at the vaccine beginning to roll out, which I think is encouraging people to really start firming up their plans as to how they're going to move forward in the so-called new normal. I don't think that's necessarily going to give us complete answers because we're still very much in the middle of this, but I think we'll start seeing how both occupiers and investors in real estate are going to respond. That won't necessarily be a constant. There are going to be lots of people trying things, but I think we're definitely moving to sort of the next phase now. And I think, a bottoming out of the markets from an activity point of view, we're likely to see more people doing things as we move into the next phase in 2021.
And Nick, how do you see in terms of the sort of flow of capital? How are you seeing that, particularly Europe versus, let's say, Asia and the US?
Well, I think we're definitely seeing some more capital flowing into Europe, certainly from Asia. I think we're going to continue to see those sort of mega drivers that have been underpinning flows over the last 10 or 15 years are going to absolutely continue. There is a weight of capital looking for core and core style investments in Asia because of the rising affluence and the growing middle class and the growth of savings there. And that money is looking for a home. Coupled with that, you've got lower for even longer. It's not lower forever. There is going to be an unwind at some point, but it ain't going to be very soon. So therefore, you've also got, investors of all kinds looking for yield, looking for return. And, with interest rates absolutely at rock bottom, government bond yields are at extremely low levels. There are still lots of arguments and quite compelling reasons for looking pretty closely at real estate. So I think generally we're going to see flows of capital into the sector. Arguably even yield compression further in some of the areas that we might think of even as being fully priced. Whether that's good value or not is a different question, but I think we may well see it. And so, more activity and capital flowing into the sector, I suspect.
And just looking at that sort of trend towards ESG, impact investing, do you see that as a key driver?
Yes, I do. I think we definitely believe that we are seeing a sort of underlying shift in values within society. There is more pressure coming through from social movements. We saw that. We've seen that from an environmental point of view, quite clearly dominant theme in 2019 through 2020. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We're seeing all sorts of, the Me Too movement, all sorts of movements that are generally suggesting that society is focusing on the environment, is focusing on inequality and social issues as a balance to the obviously all important, keeping our economies growing. And so I think that sort of rebalancing of priorities at the individual level is clearly influencing how companies are behaving. It's also influencing how governments are behaving. And in that context, even if a proportion of people allocate a proportion of their investment savings into impact funds or funds that are, more environmentally or socially aware, then that's a big pool of money that's going to be looking for a home. And I think coupled with the general desire of investment managers to be looking at different opportunities and ways of creating return in what's a pretty congested core space, that's going to encourage people to be looking in all sorts of directions. And impact investing is one end of a big spectrum of those.
And looking particularly at Europe, Nick, a lot of talk around beds, sheds and meds. What's your sense of the sectors?
Yeah, bed, sheds and meds is a pretty good place to start, actually. If you'd followed that strategy over the last few years, then you would have done pretty well. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the 10 trends that we're looking at is it highlights a lot of the underlying shifts that are going on in the world and the way in which they're both connected, but also playing out differently and having lots of impacts across the different sectors. So even if it ever was the case, and I would argue it probably wasn't, a sort of fairly simplistic which sector should I be in, it is not really the way that most of us are looking at the world at the moment, because there are nuances and there are trends. Even just within the mainstream core office sector, there's a wealth of debate around the impact of home working, the impact, what types of offices should organizations be providing, where should they be, how are people going to want to work? That's all going to play out right in the middle of, the mainstream office sector. And I think that's what people are going to be focused on. It's not whether or not you should be in offices or not. It's where and how and how are those flows going to affect and impact the market, which is so interesting.
Great to catch up with your views, Nick. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard.